In tonight's episode, we're going to travel to the heart of Ubud in Bali, where something strange and deeply unsettling happened to a young traveler named Alex. So this story takes place on the quiet streets of the town, just as the sun began to set. Locals whisper about the little offerings scattered along the sidewalks. Travelers leave with uneasy memories. So what happened there? Well, let's just say it's the kind of experience that makes you always watch your step and respect every tiny ritual you encounter. Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them takes us deep into the streets of Ubud, where the seemingly harmless palm leaf offerings hold a power most travelers never notice until it's too late. Alex, tired from hours of wandering, didn't pay attention. He walked over one of these small baskets without realizing it, and that night, his ordinary hotel room became a stage for a waking nightmare. Shadows shifted in corners, whispers followed him wherever he went, and incense at the temples seemed to coil around him, almost alive. The locals avoided him, muttering warnings in Balinese that he could not understand. Flights were delayed, strangers stared, and every step he took seemed to draw the unseen closer. What had he stepped into? What was watching him? The answers were far more terrifying than he could have imagined. Alex had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the routines of his daily life and explore the vibrant culture of Bali. The streets of Ubud called to him with the promise of art, tradition, and an almost mystical serenity. Daytime tourists filled the markets, their laughter blending with the scent of incense and spices, drifting from small roadside shrines. But as dusk approached, a different atmosphere settled over the town. The once lively streets became quieter, shadows stretching long across the cobblestones, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to vibrate through the air. He checked into a modest guest house, tucked away along a narrow alley. The building was charming in an old-world kind of way, with carved wooden panels and flowering vines climbing the walls. Inside, the air smelled faintly of frangipani and damp wood. The receptionist was polite but spoke little English, offering only a brief smile and a key. Alex felt a slight unease, though he couldn't put his finger on why. The room itself was simple but comfortable, with a small balcony overlooking the narrow street below. A few flickering candles cast soft shadows across the walls, giving the space a warm but slightly eerie glow. After setting down his bag, Alex stepped out to explore the streets again, eager to catch the last rays of sunset. That's when he began to notice the small palm leaf offerings scattered along the sidewalks. They were delicate, almost fragile in appearance, filled with flowers, rice, and a tiny stick of incense. Most tourists seemed oblivious, stepping around them without a thought, but Alex, distracted by the beauty of the town and the fading sunlight, failed to notice one directly in his path. Without realizing it, he stepped over the offering, crushing it beneath his shoe. At first, nothing seemed to happen. He continued wandering, enjoying the colors of the shops and the sounds of distant gamelan music. But as twilight deepened, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, and the usual comforting smells of incense and cooking became sharper, almost suffocating. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling in corners and alleyways. Alex felt the subtle prickling of eyes on him, though whenever he turned, the streets were empty. Locals he passed muttered under their breath, glancing at him with wary expressions, speaking quickly in Balinese before looking away. Alex tried to shake off the unease, convincing himself that he was just tired and imagining things. He wandered toward a small temple at the edge of town, hoping to find some peace in the flickering light of oil lamps and the smell of incense. The temple grounds were quiet now, the chatter of tourists gone, replaced by the soft, rhythmic chanting of the priests preparing for evening rituals. But even here, the offerings seemed to watch him. Each small basket, carefully arranged with flowers and incense, seemed almost alive, fragile yet imbued with a strange, silent authority. He sensed that something had changed, that a simple misstep could carry consequences far beyond what he understood. As night fell, Alex returned to his room, expecting comfort in the familiarity of his temporary home. Yet, even there, the unsettling feeling followed. Shadows moved in the corners of the room. Faint whispers seemed to echo from the walls, and the incense he had purchased to relax him curled around him in strange, twisting patterns. The beauty and serenity of Ubud had transformed into something far more sinister, and Alex realized that the tiny palm leaf offerings, so easily overlooked, might hold a power that demanded respect and obedience. That night, the traveler who had come seeking culture and tranquility found himself caught in the beginnings of a haunting that would test his courage and force him to confront the unseen forces of Bali in ways he had never imagined. Alex awoke the next morning with a dull ache in his head, convinced it was nothing more than the exhaustion from the long flight and the day's wandering. Sunlight streamed through the small balcony window, casting the familiar patterns of the carved wooden panels across the floor. The streets below were slowly coming to life, vendors arranging their wares and the scent of freshly cooked nasi goreng drifting upwards. Everything seemed normal, almost reassuring, and Alex told himself that last night's unease had been a product of fatigue and imagination. Yet as he prepared for the day, he noticed something unusual. A small shadow lingered in the corner of his room, dark and shifting despite the bright morning Sunday. At first, he thought it must be the angle of the light, a trick of the early sunlight filtering through the carved latticework of the window. He blinked, shook his head, even adjusted the curtains, but the shadow remained, subtle but persistent, curling along the floor and wall as though it had a life of its own. He felt a chill creep over him, an inexplicable sense of being watched, and he quickly left the room, deciding that some fresh air and movement would shake off the lingering dread. Stepping out into the streets, Alex tried to immerse himself in the daily rhythm of Ubud. He visited the market, admired the wooden carvings, and sampled local snacks from the stalls that lined the alleyways. For a time, it seemed that normality had returned. Locals greeted him politely but briefly, their eyes flicking toward the small offerings scattered on the sidewalks before they quickly looked away. Alex remembered the baskets from the previous evening and felt a moment of unease, but he shrugged it off as a coincidence. He told himself that he had stepped over one accidentally and that it couldn't possibly matter that much. By mid-afternoon, however, the first truly strange event occurred. Alex had stopped at a small cafe near the edge of the town square, drawn in by the sweet smell of coffee roasting over an open flame. As he sipped from his cup, he noticed a sudden chill pass through the air, one that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The other patrons were conversing quietly, and the barista moved behind the counter as usual, but there was an odd shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Alex felt that something unseen had entered the space. He looked around, trying to catch a glimpse of what it might be, and saw that every small offering in the immediate vicinity, the tiny baskets of flowers and rice left on the tables, tucked along the windowsill, and even a few on the floor seemed somehow brighter, more prominent than they had before. It was as if they were calling attention to themselves, a silent warning he could not read. Shrugging and trying to rationalize the sensation, Alex finished his coffee and stepped back into the narrow streets. But the moment he did, the strange occurrences multiplied. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, always vanishing when he turned to look directly. A soft, whispering murmur followed him along the alleyways, unintelligible, yet undeniably present, like a conversation just beyond comprehension. Alex paused, listening intently, but no one was there. He asked a passing vendor if he had heard anything strange, but the man shook his head, smiling politely while clearly avoiding further eye contact. Alex felt a sudden, pressing sense of being an intruder, someone who had crossed an invisible line without understanding it. He began to notice a pattern. Wherever he went, the palm leaf offerings seemed to occupy a space just beyond his attention, almost imperceptibly shifting position when he wasn't looking. A basket he had walked past moments earlier appeared slightly closer. Another seemed freshly arranged, even though the streets had been empty. Alex's curiosity deepened into unease, but he pressed on, attempting to continue with his day. He visited a small temple at the edge of town, hoping for guidance, or at least some sense of normalcy. The incense burned as usual, curling into the air in thin, fragrant streams. Priests moved with deliberate motions, chanting softly. Yet even here, Alex sensed a subtle tension, an invisible gaze that seemed to follow his every movement. The first real question began to form in his mind. Was it possible that stepping over the offering had triggered something he could not see? At first, the idea seemed ridiculous. These baskets were simple acts of devotion, left on sidewalks as part of daily rituals. How could ignoring one bring about such a profound sense of being watched? And yet, the sensations persisted. Every corner he turned, every narrow alleyway he passed, seemed charged with a presence that wasn't there yesterday, or perhaps a presence that had been there all along, waiting. By evening, Alex's concern had grown. He returned to his guest house, hoping to find solace in the familiar confines of his room. The sunlight had faded, leaving shadows deep and cool against the carved walls. He placed his bag down and moved toward the small balcony to take in the night air. That's when he noticed it again. The corner shadow, darker and more defined than this morning, as if it had grown overnight. A subtle scratching sound echoed from the far wall, soft and intermittent, like fingernails against wood. He froze, straining to listen, and the whispers returned, this time more distinct but still incomprehensible. Alex realized that whatever he had brushed off as imagination might be far more real than he had dared to consider. The streets of Ubud, so vibrant and welcoming in daylight, had become something altogether different after dark, a space in which the ordinary world intersected with forces he could not yet understand. The first complication had arrived, subtle and insidious, marking the beginning of a series of events that would slowly but relentlessly pull him deeper into a nightmare he could neither see nor control. By the time he finally turned in for the night, Alex understood that stepping over that small palm leaf basket was not just an accident, it was the opening act of a haunting that had only just begun. The following evening, Alex stepped back onto the streets of Ubud with a sense of trepidation that had been steadily growing since his first night. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the town bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and streetlights. Shadows stretched along narrow alleyways, curling around doorways and under shop awnings. He tried to convince himself that yesterday's events were merely coincidence, the result of tired eyes and overactive imagination. Yet the unease had lodged deep in his chest, a persistent weight that refused to be shaken off. As he walked, the first strange event of the night occurred almost immediately. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure dart past a narrow alley, barely more than a blur, yet unmistakably human. Alex turned sharply, expecting to catch a passer-by or a curious local child, but the alley was empty. The faint sounds of distant gamelan music and the occasional chatter of tourists carried normally through the evening air, yet the shadow seemed to linger in his periphery, following him with a silent intent. A shiver ran down his spine. He had no idea what or who was observing him, but the feeling of being watched intensified, gnawing at the edges of his rational mind. Moving forward, he entered a quieter part of town, a small square lined with temples and shrines. Here, the offerings seemed to proliferate. Tiny palm leaf baskets rested on steps, windowsills, and low walls. Each seemed almost alive, positioned with an uncanny precision that Alex hadn't noticed during his daylight walks. As he passed one basket, he heard a faint rustling, soft, like the whisper of silk, but there was no wind. His pulse quickened. A vague sense of guilt gnawed at him, a knowledge that the simple act of stepping over an offering had drawn attention he could not see. It was then that a conflicting character appeared. An older local man emerged from the shadows, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. His eyes were dark, intense, and fixed on Alex as though he could see straight into his thoughts. "You must not ignore them," the man said in halting English, voice low but urgent. "They notice. They follow. You cannot leave until you make it right." Alex, caught off guard, asked what he meant. The man shook his head, muttering words in Balinese that Alex could not understand, his gaze shifting nervously toward the alleyways and streets around them. Before Alex could press for more, the man turned abruptly and disappeared into the night, leaving a heavy silence behind, punctuated only by the soft flicker of temple lamps. Unease coiled tighter in Alex's chest. He wanted answers, yet every explanation seemed just out of reach. The whispering he had noticed the night before returned, this time louder and layered, almost like multiple voices speaking simultaneously just beyond comprehension. Shadows now moved in ways that defied logic, a swaying curtain casting shapes that shouldn't exist, a flickering lamp producing elongated, twisting forms on the walls. The sense of being followed grew stronger, pressing against him even as he walked in well-lit areas. A second strange event escalated the terror further. As Alex passed a small alley, he glimpsed a reflection in a polished shop window. At first, he assumed it was his own reflection, but then he saw it. A figure standing just behind him, pale and thin, features indistinct, eyes hollow and staring. He spun around. The alley was empty. Heart hammering, he turned back to the window. The reflection remained, his own form now merged with that shadowy presence, a distorted echo of himself that vanished when he blinked. The sense of intrusion, of something reaching out from the unseen world, was overwhelming. Each step he took seemed to deepen the mystery. Offers of small gifts at temple entrances, gestures he had once ignored, now seemed laden with significance. Every whispered warning from locals, every fleeting shadow, every misaligned basket told him something he could not fully understand. He felt caught in a pattern he had no control over, as if each movement carried unseen consequences. He was beginning to realize that nothing in Ubud at night was quite as it appeared the town was alive, with quiet forces that watched, waited, and judged, subtly manipulating events around him. By the time Alex returned to his guest house, the weight of the night pressed heavily upon him. The room felt colder, darker, the shadows deeper than before. He knew instinctively that this was only the beginning. The conflicting warning, the eerie reflections, and the presence that shadowed him all formed a tangled web of tension. Each layer added, made the ordinary streets of Ubud feel like a labyrinth, every step a test, every glance a potential threat. And yet, despite the mounting fear, Alex could not look away. The sense of being trapped between the seen and unseen, between the ordinary and the supernatural, was intoxicating and terrifying, leaving him desperate to understand what force had been set against him, and how far it would go to make him pay for a single misstep over a simple offering. Night had fully descended over Ubud, and Alex felt every step heavier than the last. The streets, once vibrant with the scent of spices and flowers, had become oppressive corridors of shadow and silence. Lanterns flickered weakly, casting distorted shapes on the walls, making even the most familiar alleyways seem alien. The palm leaf offerings, which had seemed harmless only days ago, now appeared in unexpected places, at the foot of his door, perched on the balcony railing, tucked into cracks in the stone pathways. Each one seemed deliberate, a silent accusation that pressed on his mind, forcing him to acknowledge the small but inexorable mistake he had made. As he moved cautiously through the town square, a sudden, piercing sound broke the stillness, the faint scraping of wood on stone, coming from somewhere just beyond the line of sight. He froze, straining to locate its source. Shadows danced unnaturally across the walls of the surrounding temples, and the flicker of the lanterns seemed almost like eyes following him. Then he saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the square, indistinct but undeniably human in shape. Pale, thin, motionless, yet somehow emanating an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Alex's heart pounded, a mix of fear and fascination rooting him to the spot. The figure did not move, yet Alex felt an invisible force pressing toward him, a tightening of the air that made each breath difficult. Whispers swirled around him, soft at first, unintelligible, then forming words that clawed at his comprehension. Respect, do not ignore, pay your due. He spun in a circle, searching for a source, but the square was empty save for the pale figure. Every time he blinked, it seemed closer, as if the shadows themselves were carrying it toward him. The streetlights flickered violently, plunging him into intermittent darkness, and in those brief moments, the figure would vanish, only to reappear the instant the light returned. Alex stumbled backward, desperation rising. He remembered the words of the old man he had encountered earlier, the conflicting character who had warned him in broken English. You cannot leave until you make it right. At the time, the message had seemed cryptic, almost absurd, but now it made horrifying sense. The offerings, the whispers, the shadows, they were not passive. They demanded acknowledgement, attention, respect. Each misstep, each glance away from their presence had been noticed, and now the consequence had manifested with terrifying clarity. The tension escalated further when another figure emerged from a nearby alley. This one was different. Older, hunched, face obscured by a woven hat, hands clutching what appeared to be a small ritual object. The figure moved deliberately toward Alex, yet its approach was unnatural, almost gliding over the uneven stones. Alex could see the faint glow of incense smoke curling around the figure, twisting in impossible patterns, coiling in the air like living tendrils. The whispers intensified, layering over one another, creating a cacophony of unintelligible voices that made his head spin. Fear and confusion melded into something almost paralyzing. Alex did not understand the rules of this unfolding nightmare. Were these spirits angry? Protective? Did they want to harm him, or was this a test, a ritual of some kind that he had unwittingly disrupted? Every instinct screamed to flee, yet the streets seemed to fold around him, turning simple pathways into labyrinthine passages where he could not escape, each turn bringing him closer to the shadowy figures, not farther. Then, almost suddenly, the intensity shifted. The first figure, the pale, silent one, stopped moving. Its presence remained, but the oppressive force lessened slightly, as if it were observing him, waiting for something. The second figure, carrying the ritual object, paused a few steps away, tilting its head in a gesture that seemed to combine scrutiny with warning. Alex's mind raced. Could there be a way to make amends? To placate whatever force he had disturbed? His gaze fell upon the nearest palm leaf basket, lying untouched at the base of a temple stair. A tentative thought struck him. Maybe the act of giving back, of acknowledging the offering, could change everything. Shadows lengthened and twisted around him as he approached the basket. The whispers continued, now sounding more like urgent guidance than unintelligible noise. Each step felt as if it carried the weight of centuries of unseen eyes upon him. Sweat poured down his face, yet his movements were deliberate. Finally, he knelt before the small basket, hands trembling, and carefully placed a few flowers and a handful of rice atop it, mimicking the care and devotion he had seen in every other offering in the town. The incense nearby seemed to flare for a brief instant, the smoke spiraling in intricate, almost deliberate patterns. Alex took a deep breath, rising slowly. The oppressive presence in the square remained, yet it felt lighter, less hostile. The pale figure receded into the shadows, vanishing from sight, while the older figure with the ritual object gave a subtle nod before disappearing into an alleyway, leaving the square eerily silent. Alex was alone, or at least alone enough to think he might have regained some control over his surroundings. But despite the momentary relief, a deep unease lingered. He realized that he had only glimpsed the power of the unseen forces that governed the streets of Ubud. Forces that were patient, meticulous, and unforgiving. One misstep, one moment of distraction, had brought him face to face with the unknown. And though he had made amends for now, he could not shake the feeling that the eyes of the town's hidden guardians were still upon him, watching, waiting for the next mistake, the next transgression, the next opportunity to remind him that in Bali, nothing, even the smallest offering, is ever truly insignificant. Alex collapsed onto the balcony of his guest house, sweat still clinging to his skin, heart hammering in his chest. The night had been relentless, a relentless escalation of shadows, whispers, and impossible movements. He stared down at the streets below, trying to make sense of the events that had consumed him. Each corner he had turned, each basket he had overlooked, seemed to have carried a hidden consequence, a ripple of unseen force that now haunted every step of his journey. He thought of the pale figure in the square, the older man with the ritual object, and the whispers that had never truly ceased. The answers, he realized, were not fully within his grasp, but fragments were starting to emerge. Later that night, as he rested on the narrow balcony railing, a soft knock sounded at his door. It was tentative but deliberate, enough to startle him after hours of being alone. Hesitant, he opened the door and found one of the guest house staff standing there. She was quiet, small-framed, with eyes that seemed both wary and knowing. She held a small incense burner in her hands, and the fragrance of frangipani and sandalwood drifted out into the cool night air. Without a word, she gestured for him to follow her to the small courtyard behind the building. Confused but compelled, Alex obeyed, the events of the evening still pressing heavily upon him. The courtyard was dimly lit, with flickering lanterns casting uneven shadows across stone pathways. Tiny offerings had been placed meticulously around a central shrine, each one neat and carefully arranged. The staff woman knelt, lifting the incense burner and waving it gently around the shrine. The smoke curled and twisted, almost alive, spiraling upward in delicate, deliberate patterns. She then turned to Alex, her gaze steady, almost solemn, and spoke in broken English. "The spirits, they are always here. They watch, they protect, they punish if disrespected. You stepped over the offering. You must show respect, always." Alex's mind struggled to comprehend her words. The baskets he had passed, the subtle movements in the shadows, the whispers that had filled his nights, all of it now began to take shape as a coherent thread. These offerings were not mere decoration or simple gestures of faith. They were markers, conduits of power, a system of balance maintained by unseen forces. The spirits associated with each offering were guardians, subtle yet relentless, and any misstep, any oversight invited their attention. The events he had dismissed as coincidence, each shadow, each murmur, each fleeting reflection, were not random. They were reactions, responses to a disturbance he had unwittingly caused. As she spoke, she guided him to a small basket at the center of the courtyard, explaining the ritual of placing a personal offering. Alex mimicked her actions, laying down a few flowers and grains of rice, bowing his head as he whispered a quiet apology. The incense smoke thickened, swirling around him in patterns that seemed almost purposeful, curling around his body as if to embrace and release him. A sense of weight lifted slightly from his chest, and the oppressive atmosphere that had clung to him for days began to ease. The world did not become completely normal, but it became bearable, ordered, and understandable in a way it had not before. The partial resolution offered Alex a crucial insight. The haunting he had experienced was not random malevolence, but a structured response to a breach of tradition. He realized that the seemingly innocuous baskets on the sidewalks were in fact a form of communication, a ritualistic system designed to maintain harmony between the human world and the unseen. Every whisper he heard, every fleeting shadow, every unexplainable movement had been a reminder of his obligation to this hidden order, a subtle but insistent guide to correct his mistake. Yet, even as this revelation settled in, Alex could not ignore the lingering unease. The staff woman had provided him with guidance, but not with full explanation. He understood that stepping over the offerings had triggered a tension, that respect and restitution were required, and that the spirits were persistent and vigilant, but he still did not fully comprehend the scope of their power. The forces he had encountered were patient, subtle, and ancient, operating within a framework he barely understood. The streets of Ubud were alive in ways that were hidden from casual observation, and the delicate balance of offerings and acknowledgement was a system he had only begun to grasp. As Alex returned to his room, the courtyard now silent behind him, he reflected on the events of the past days. The tension, the escalating encounters, the whispered warnings, they all made sense in a new light. What had seemed chaotic, random, and terrifying was actually a form of communication, a framework of rules, and respect that governed interactions between the living and the unseen guardians of the island. He understood now why the whispers followed him, why the shadows shifted, why the pale figure had loomed at the edge of the square. They were responses, reactions to an imbalance he had caused. Alex sank onto the bed, exhausted, but deeply contemplative. The partial resolution did not bring full comfort. He knew that the spirits were still present, still observing, still capable of action, but it reframed everything he had experienced. He had been given the knowledge necessary to navigate the delicate terrain of Ubud's unseen world, a path of respect and careful attention that would prevent further escalation. And yet, he also knew that ignorance, distraction, or arrogance could undo all of it in an instant, bringing back the shadows, the whispers, and the restless presence that had haunted him from the moment he had stepped over a single fragile offering. In that quiet realization, Alex understood something fundamental. The unseen world of Bali was patient and deliberate, rewarding those who paid heed and punishing those who did not. He had glimpsed a system of unseen guardians, forces that measured attention, respect, and intent. The lessons were subtle, the boundaries fragile, and the consequences relentless. And though the immediate danger had receded, Alex knew that the night had left its mark, an indelible awareness that even the smallest actions, the tiniest missteps, could summon forces that never forgot and never forgave. The next morning, Alex packed his bag with a cautious efficiency, each movement deliberate, as if even a careless gesture might draw unseen eyes. The streets of Ubud seemed normal in the early light, vendors calling out their greetings, the scent of fresh fruit and incense mingling in the warm air. Yet Alex could not shake the lingering awareness that normalcy was fragile, that the balance he had temporarily restored could be upset with a single misstep. As he walked toward the taxi, waiting to take him to the airport, he noticed the offerings once again, small baskets resting neatly along the sidewalks. He scanned each one carefully, stepping around them, bowing slightly in silent acknowledgement. The townspeople passed by, faces calm, smiles polite, but he felt their gaze linger in a way that made the hair on his neck prickle. The lessons of the past nights were etched into his mind. Respect every basket, honor every gesture, and never underestimate what lies beneath the ordinary. The taxi arrived, and Alex climbed in, relief mingling with exhaustion. He watched Ubud recede in the rearview mirror, streets shrinking beneath him, lanterns flickering into dots of light. Yet even as the distance grew, a sudden unease settled over him, sharper and colder than before. In the corner of the window, reflected in the glass, he glimpsed something pale and fleeting. He blinked. Nothing was there. He told himself it was just fatigue, the residue of nights filled with whispers and shadows. But then he noticed it again, a tiny basket resting on the curb, flowers perfectly arranged, incense smoke curling faintly, impossibly, against the morning breeze. He hadn't stepped over it. He hadn't disturbed it in any way. And yet, the sense of being watched pressed against him once more, insistent, patient, and unyielding. Alex leaned back in his seat, heart pounding, realizing that the experience was far from over. The offerings, the shadows, the unseen guardians they had not forgiven, and perhaps they never would. As the taxi pulled away, the streets of Ubud shrinking behind him, one question remained. Had he truly escaped, or was he simply carrying the presence with him, a silent shadow that would never release its hold? And somewhere, in the flicker of the wind, a whisper seemed to follow, "One misstep is all it takes." Just as Alex had learned the consequences of disrespecting the small offerings, scattered across Ubud, another traveler would face a far more immediate and terrifying punishment for ignoring sacred traditions. On the eve of Nyepi, May, an inexperienced tourist, wandered among the Tawur Kasanga parade, mesmerized by the grotesque ogoh-ogoh effigies twisting under the moonlight. Curious and careless, she touched the head of one, laughing at its exaggerated features. That simple act, playful in intent, unleashed a curse that followed her from her villa into every reflection, every shadow, every darkened corner. Both stories reveal the same unsettling truth. In Bali, the unseen world watches every action, and even small missteps in ritual or respect can bring consequences that follow a visitor far beyond the island's shores. One story done, and one to go. I hope you liked the stories so far. When I make these long videos, there are nights where I stay up really late working on them. Tomorrow I will be uploading another video. If you don't want to miss it, please subscribe. It's free and it would help my channel get some recognition for daily posting. Thank you. May had always been drawn to the vibrant culture of Bali, eager to witness its unique traditions firsthand. She arrived in a small village near Ubud, just as preparations for Nyepi, the Balinese Day of Silence, were underway. The streets buzzed with anticipation, locals hurriedly constructing the enormous ogoh-ogoh effigies for the upcoming Tawur Kasanga parade. These grotesque, towering monsters, crafted from bamboo, papier-mâché, and vivid paints, were designed to represent evil spirits, meant to be paraded through the village and then ritually destroyed to cleanse the community of negativity. May, excited and curious, had never seen anything like it before. The village itself seemed suspended between celebration and something far older, almost primal. Narrow pathways wound between traditional thatched roof houses, and the faint glow of oil lamps cast long, twisting shadows along the walls. The air smelled of incense, burning coconut husks, and freshly cut bamboo, a mix both enticing and vaguely unsettling. Laughter and chanting echoed through the alleys, but beneath the festive noise, May could sense something unspoken, a tension she could not quite identify. Locals moved with careful precision, setting the ogoh-ogoh in place, performing ritual gestures, murmuring prayers that May could not understand, yet felt compelled to watch. That evening, she wandered among the preparations, her attention drawn to the largest of the effigies. Its grotesque face twisted into an exaggerated snarl, eyes wide, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Its painted fangs gleamed under the flickering lamplight. Despite the warnings whispered among the villagers' gestures of caution, hurried looks, averted gazes, May approached, enchanted by the artistry and sheer size of the figure. Curiosity overcame her hesitation. She reached out, brushing her hand over the ogoh-ogoh's head, laughing at the exaggerated features. She imagined herself part of the celebration, a visitor sharing in a moment of tradition, oblivious to the weight of the act. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the village transformed. What had been lively and inviting during the day now felt suffused with shadows. The streets narrowed under the deepening twilight. Lanterns flickered with an unsteady glow, and the soft chanting of villagers grew more solemn, almost foreboding. The ogoh-ogoh lined the paths, towering and grotesque, their painted faces seeming to leer in the dim light. Each step May took felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted her movements. The excitement she had felt earlier was replaced by a creeping unease, a quiet tension that threaded through the celebration, like an invisible hand tightening around her. May's villa, where she would retreat later that night, was a traditional Balinese compound, quiet and intimate, tucked behind high walls and shadowed by frangipani trees. From the moment she arrived, the space felt different under the cover of darkness, the shadows shifting unnaturally, the scent of incense more pungent and almost suffocating. She thought she would find comfort in its familiar structures, the carved wooden panels, the small courtyard, the soft flicker of lamps, but instead, a subtle unease lingered, a sense that the villa itself was aware of her actions among the ogoh-ogoh. She was here to experience a sacred tradition, to witness the parade, to capture memories of a culture vibrant and alive. But the mood of the village that evening suggested that participation was not enough. Observation was not enough. The slightest disrespect, the smallest misstep, could awaken something far older, far less forgiving. As night descended, the air grew heavy, shadows lengthened, and the towering figures of the ogoh-ogoh seemed to watch, silently waiting. May had no idea that a single touch, a moment of careless curiosity, would bind her to a nightmare that reached far beyond the village streets, one that would follow her long after the parade had ended and the villagers had gone home. As night fell over the village, May returned to her villa, the excitement of the parade still buzzing faintly in her mind. The moon cast pale silver light across the courtyard, illuminating the intricate carvings of the wooden panels and the neatly arranged frangipani flowers. The air smelled of smoke and incense, familiar yet sharper somehow, heavier than before. She felt the lingering energy of the Tawur Kasanga parade, the towering ogoh-ogoh looming in her memory. But what had seemed playful and intriguing earlier now carried an unspoken weight, an almost imperceptible tension threading through the night. The first sign that something was wrong came subtly, almost as if the villa itself was aware of her actions. May heard it first as a faint dragging sound, soft but deliberate, echoing across the polished stone floors of placed floors. Her villa. At first, she thought it was a stray animal, perhaps a neighbor moving supplies. But the sound repeated in irregular, heavy steps, moving slowly from one corner of the compound to another. Each scrape of something unseen against the floorboards made her heart quicken. She glanced around, expecting to see someone entering the room, a member of the staff or a family resident of the villa. Yet the space remained empty, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. Unease began to creep in, wrapping itself around her thoughts. The villa, which had seemed so welcoming in the afternoon, now felt alien. Doors she had left open earlier appeared slightly ajar, their hinges squeaking faintly, as though moved by invisible hands. Curtains swayed without any breeze, the frangipani-scented smoke curling in tight spirals, almost deliberate in its movement. She shook her head, trying to convince herself that it was merely her imagination, that her nerves were fraying after a day of travel and excitement. Yet, every instinct told her that something was observing her, unseen but palpable, like a presence pressing just beyond the edge of perception. Then came the shadows. May saw them moving along the edges of the room, shapes that mimicked the grotesque faces of the ogoh-ogoh she had touched earlier. At first, it was fleeting a flicker of movement in a mirror, a silhouette across the wall, but soon it became more defined. The shapes twisted and swayed, echoing the exaggerated features of the effigies, mouths opening in silent screams, eyes wide and unblinking. She blinked hard, looking directly at the reflections, only to see them staring back, more distinct, as though the parade had followed her home. Her first real obstacle arrived in the form of a whispering murmur, low and almost indecipherable, winding around the villa like a serpent. At first, she could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, accusatory, and insistent. Each time she tried to move toward the sound, it seemed to shift, moving just out of reach, always coming from a place she could not access. The invisible rhythm of the whispers made her feel disoriented, a sense of motion even while standing still, the room itself bending subtly around her perception. The villa, once familiar and comforting, had become a maze. Every corner she turned seemed to reveal something new, a grotesque mimicry of the ogoh-ogoh figures, now present in shadows, mirrors, and even in the darkened surfaces of polished furniture. She caught glimpses of pale hands reaching toward her, only to vanish when she tried to focus. Floors creaked under weight that could not exist, chains rattled faintly in rooms where nothing hung from the ceilings. The villa seemed alive, responding to her presence, echoing the careless touch she had given to the effigy. May realized she was not alone. Though no one was physically present, the spirits had followed her, their energy manifesting in tangible, disorienting ways. Each reflection, each shadow, each faint noise was a reminder of her misstep. Her first question emerged clearly. Had her curiosity, her innocent touch of the ogoh-ogoh, bound her to these spirits? She tried to reason with herself, to laugh it off, But the weight of awareness pressed harder. Every mirror, every darkened window, now seemed to hold a pair of eyes staring back at her, grinning, grotesque, patient, and accusing. By the time May sank to the floor, knees tucked close, she understood that this first complication was only the beginning. The act that had seemed so trivial, touching a sacred effigy, had triggered a cascade of phenomena she could neither explain nor ignore. The footsteps, the dragging chains, the shadows and mirrors, and the whispered murmurs formed a network of tension and unease that anchored her firmly within the villa, a space that was supposed to be safe. The unseen presence made it impossible to rest, impossible to rationalize, impossible to pretend that she had not crossed a boundary she did not yet understand. Every instinct urged her to flee, to escape the villa and the village altogether. Yet even as she considered it, the shadows seemed to pulse, shifting with a consciousness of their own. Her first real encounter with the supernatural had arrived, subtle but unmistakable, setting the stage for a night in which ordinary rules no longer applied, and in which the consequences of her curiosity would grow stronger, closer, and far more inescapable than she could imagine. The night deepened over the village, and May felt a persistent unease threading through every corner of her villa. The first complication, the dragging chains, the shadows shaped like ogoh-ogoh, had already unsettled her, but the tension was far from over. As she moved cautiously through the courtyard, trying to gather herself, a second strange event occurred that made her blood run cold. The mirrors lining the walls, which had seemed normal during the day, now reflected more than just her own image. In each one, she glimpsed the grotesque faces of the ogoh-ogoh, their wide eyes staring straight into hers, mouths twisted into silent, eternal screams. At first, she thought it a trick of the flickering lanterns, a result of shadows playing across the polished surfaces, but the reflection moved independently, sometimes lagging slightly behind her motions, as if the effigies were following her even when she turned away. May stumbled back, her heart pounding, and sought refuge near the villa's small inner garden. The night air was heavy with incense, curling into the space in thick, aromatic streams, almost tangible as it wove around her. It seemed to carry a presence, an energy that pressed against her from all sides. Then, from the far corner of the garden, she noticed someone or something watching. An older local woman emerged from the shadows, her face partially hidden beneath a woven hat, her eyes dark and filled with both concern and warning. She spoke softly, her English hesitant, broken but urgent. You cannot touch. Respect, the spirits do not forgive lightly." May wanted to ask for clarification, to plead her innocence. But the woman's eyes darted nervously toward the villa walls and the mirrors, as if aware of a presence she could feel but not fully see. Without waiting for a response, she retreated into the shadows, leaving May trembling and confused, clutching at a sense of understanding that was just beyond her reach. The whispers returned then, layered and insistent, a chorus of murmurs swirling through the villa. At first, they were indistinct, almost drowned out by the rustling of leaves and the gentle evening breeze. Gradually, however, they became clearer, weaving together fragmented words. Pay respect, do not mock, give back, do not laugh. Each phrase seemed to echo from every corner at once. Impossible to locate, impossible to ignore. The air felt charged, electric, with an energy that seemed to respond to her every movement, amplifying her fear. Another subtle yet disorienting phenomenon compounded the terror. Objects that had been stationary during the day, ornamental statues, small bowls, even the incense burner she had set down, appeared to shift slightly whenever she looked away. The shadows stretched unnaturally, bending and curling in impossible directions. For a moment, She caught the movement of a tiny effigy head sliding across the floor by itself, stopping just inches from her foot. She recoiled, gasping, unable to tell if it was truly moving or if her perception had been warped by exhaustion and fear. The cumulative effect of these layers, mirrors reflecting grotesque faces, whispered warnings, shifting objects, and the watchful presence of the older woman made the villa feel alive, sentient, and hostile. May realized she had stepped into a world with rules she did not understand, where every action, no matter how small, could provoke a response from forces both subtle and relentless. She wanted to escape, to flee into the night streets, but the shadows seemed to follow her wherever she went, the whispers growing louder, pressing against her mind like a living weight. By the time she sank into a chair near the garden fountain, exhaustion and fear mingled into a heavy, disorienting fog. She knew that the first misstep, the playful touch of the ogoh-ogoh's head, had opened the door to something much larger, something patient, deliberate, and impossible to reason with. Each successive layer of tension, each strange warning and encounter confirmed that the village, the spirits, and the sacred effigies were entwined in a system of judgment she had violated. May understood in that moment that she was no longer a passive observer. She had become a participant in a ritual she could not control, a game with stakes she could barely comprehend. And yet, despite the fear, a small, nagging part of her curiosity remained. She wanted answers, desperately, though the night had already made it clear that such knowledge would not be freely given. Every whisper, every shifting shadow, every watchful presence served as a reminder that she was trapped in a delicate balance between disrespect and restitution, between the unseen guardians of tradition and the unpredictable consequences of her actions. The night stretched on, heavy and unyielding, a tense prelude to the events that would escalate even further, testing her courage, her understanding, and her very grip on reality. Night had fully descended over the village, and May felt the weight of it pressing down on her from every angle. The villa, once a haven of quiet comfort, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The mirrors reflected more than her own image. Now they displayed grotesque faces of ogoh-ogoh, their mouths twisted in silent screams, eyes wide with uncanny awareness. Even when she turned away, the reflections lingered, a persistent reminder that the spirits were watching, judging, waiting. Her heart pounded, each beat echoing the urgency of the invisible forces closing in. As she moved through the villa, the whispers grew louder, forming an almost coherent chorus. Respect, do not touch, do not mock. The words circled her, coming from every direction at once, impossible to pinpoint. It was as if the villa itself had become an extension of the Tawur Kasanga parade, the effigies animated by unseen hands, their presence no longer confined to bamboo and papier-mâché. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of lantern light, felt deliberate, a part of the ritual she had unknowingly disrupted. Then came the second figure. From the shadows of the corridor emerged an older Balinese woman, her face partially obscured by a woven hat, eyes dark and intent. She carried a small incense burner, and the fragrant smoke swirled in intricate patterns that seemed almost alive. Her gaze fixed on May, intense and unwavering, as if she could see into the depths of the young woman's thoughts. "You must give back. You must show respect," she murmured in broken English, her voice urgent yet calm, carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed these forces before. Before May could respond, she stepped back into the shadows, vanishing, leaving a silence heavy with expectation. As May stood frozen, the first truly bizarre and terrifying event unfolded. In the largest mirror of the room, the ogoh-ogoh figures began to move independently of her own reflection. Their twisted faces contorted further, mouths opening as if to scream, though no sound emerged. The shadows of their bodies stretched impossibly long, twisting along the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling, creating a disorienting maze that made the villa feel infinitely larger than it was. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying the scent of smoke, flowers, and something acrid, sharp enough to make her cough. Fear clawed at her chest as she backed away, only to find that her own reflection lagged behind her movements, distorted and grotesque. The ogoh-ogoh eyes seemed to bore into hers, mocking, patient, and accusing. Her pulse raced, but amidst the terror, a small thought crystallized. Perhaps the spirits were not here to harm her, but to guide her, to demand recognition and restitution for her carelessness. Driven by this instinct, she approached a small ogoh-ogoh effigy that had been left at the villa's inner courtyard. Her hands trembled as she picked up flowers, grains of rice, and small offerings she had purchased earlier in the day. Kneeling before the figure, she arranged them carefully, bowing her head in apology. The incense smoke thickened around her, curling in deliberate, spiraling patterns that seemed almost sentient, brushing against her skin like invisible fingers. The shadows paused for a moment, the whispers softened, and the villa seemed to hold its breath. Then, a profound shift occurred. The reflections in the mirrors stabilized. The grotesque faces ceased their mimicry and instead appeared to observe quietly, as if acknowledging her act of respect. The oppressive energy that had pressed against her all evening lightened, giving her a fleeting sense of relief. The villa, though still shadowed and alive with subtle movements, no longer felt hostile. She could breathe more freely, though the memory of the night's earlier terror lingered, vivid and undeniable. Yet, even in this moment of partial relief, May understood the deeper lesson. The world she had stepped into was ancient, deliberate, and exacting. The spirits, the effigies, the whispers, they were patient, testing her attention and respect. One careless act had brought chaos and fear, and one careful act had restored balance, if only temporarily. As she rose, a faint breeze carried the echo of whispered words, softer now, almost gentle. Respect. Always. Never forget. The villa settled into an uneasy calm, and May realized that she had glimpsed a realm that existed parallel to her own, a realm where actions, even seemingly trivial ones, had consequences far beyond ordinary comprehension. The peak confrontation had changed her perception entirely. She no longer saw Bali as a picturesque village of lanterns and festivals. She understood viscerally that the unseen was patient, vigilant, and always present, ready to respond to those who disregarded its rules. Even as calm returned, the final twist lingered in her mind. Had she truly appeased the spirits, or had she only delayed the inevitable? The uncertainty pressed against her, a shadow at the edge of relief, leaving her aware that this encounter would not easily fade, and that the village and the unseen world within it would never release her completely. Exhausted and trembling, May sank to the edge of the villa's inner courtyard, the faint glow of lanterns casting long, flickering shadows around her. The chaos of the night, the moving reflections, the grotesque faces, the dragging chains, the whispers that seemed to come from every corner had left her mind spinning. She tried to make sense of what had happened, but every explanation she offered herself sounded hollow, inadequate, and easily dismissed by the pounding of her own fear. Every instinct told her that the world she had entered was governed by rules she could not fully comprehend, and that the seemingly playful act of touching the ogoh-ogoh had triggered consequences far beyond her imagination. Then, a soft movement caught her eye. The older Balinese woman, the same one who had appeared earlier in the corridor, emerged from the shadows once more. This time, she carried a small, intricately carved incense burner, the smoke curling in elaborate, deliberate patterns. Her face was calm, yet her eyes held the weight of knowledge, as if she had witnessed countless missteps and witnessed the consequences that followed. Without waiting for May to speak, she lifted the incense and began a quiet, rhythmic movement around the courtyard, guiding the smoke over each effigy, each offering, and finally circling around May herself. The spirits, they watch, they see every act, every touch, every glance, she murmured in broken English. The ogoh-ogoh, they are not toys, they are guardians. They carry the energy of the night, the power of the unseen. You did not respect. You must give back. May listened, heart hammering, as the woman's words settled over her like a revelation. The whispers, the shadows, the reflections, everything she had experienced was not random chaos. It was a carefully measured response to her intrusion, a structured reaction from a world she had failed to acknowledge properly. Guided by the woman's movements, May knelt before one of the smaller ogoh-ogoh effigies that had been placed in the courtyard. She carefully laid down flowers and grains of rice, mimicking the gestures she had seen the villagers perform earlier in the day. She whispered an apology, unsure if the spirits could hear her words, yet compelled to speak them regardless. The incense smoke thickened, curling around her hands, arms, and shoulders, brushing against her skin like invisible fingers. In that moment, the oppressive weight that had pressed on her all evening seemed to lift slightly, as if acknowledging her act of respect. The reflections in the villa's mirrors began to shift. The grotesque faces that had haunted her all night paused, mouths still in silent screams, eyes fixed upon her. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they receded into the mirrors, their presence no longer as immediate or threatening. The shadows that had twisted unnaturally across walls and floors softened, their movements becoming less frantic, more measured. The dragging sounds of chains and footsteps faded into the background, leaving only a subtle hum of energy that seemed to settle over the villa, as though it had recognized her efforts to make amends. May began to understand a fundamental truth. The world she had inadvertently disturbed was not inherently malevolent, but exacting and patient. The ogoh-ogoh, the spirits, the whispered warnings, all were part of a system designed to maintain balance, to ensure that respect and intention were given their due. Her experiences had been a direct result of crossing that balance, and the partial resolution came not from banishing the spirits, but from acknowledging them, offering restitution, and demonstrating understanding. Yet, even as relief settled over her, a lingering unease remained. The older woman did not explain the full extent of the spirit's power, or the consequences of future missteps. May realized that she had been shown only a glimpse of the unseen world, a fragment of its rules and boundaries. The act of restitution had appeased the immediate tension, but it did not erase the memory of the terrifying night, nor did it guarantee that the spirits would not return should she falter again. As the woman finally retreated into the shadows, May was left alone, the villa quiet but charged with a subtle, watchful energy. The partial resolution reframed everything she had experienced. The mirrors, the shadows, the whispers, the moving objects. They were not random hauntings, but deliberate signs, mechanisms through which the unseen world communicated its rules. She understood that care, attention, and respect were not optional, they were essential. The only way to navigate a realm that operated beyond ordinary perception. Sitting in the courtyard, May felt both relieved and profoundly aware of her vulnerability. She had glimpsed a system older and more complex than she could comprehend, a network of spirits and guardians that measured actions and intentions with unerring patience. The revelation offered clarity, but it also left questions unanswered. How far did their reach extend? What other rituals or acts demanded attention? And most unsettling of all, had she truly appeased them, or merely delayed the consequences that would inevitably follow? In the quiet aftermath, May understood that the night had changed her perception forever. Bali, its rituals, its ogoh-ogoh, and the unseen forces that accompanied them were no longer simply cultural curiosities to be observed or touched. They were living, responsive, and patient, and she had learned that the smallest gesture of disrespect could carry consequences far beyond her understanding. The partial resolution offered a moment of calm, but the knowledge remained. The unseen world would not forget, and she had only just begun to understand the cost of crossing it. As the first light of dawn brushed over the village, May hurriedly packed her belongings, her hands trembling despite the small comfort of daylight. The villa, once cloaked in shadows and whispers, seemed quieter now, but the memory of the night's horrors pressed against her mind like a lingering fog. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lanterns, felt loaded with unspoken warning. She moved with deliberate care, scanning the corners of the villa for signs of the ogoh-ogoh she had disturbed. Each basket an effigy, a reminder of her mistake. Stepping into the street, she noticed the villagers already going about their day, the energy of preparation for Nyepi still palpable but subdued. She offered polite nods, careful to keep her distance from the towering ogoh-ogoh lined along the pathways. Each step she took was measured, deliberate, as if she could feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking her, assessing her actions. A subtle, chilling thought crept into her mind. Had she truly appeased the spirits, or merely postponed the consequences? The taxi waiting at the edge of the village felt like a fragile lifeline. May climbed in, heart racing, and watched as the familiar streets receded. The ogoh-ogoh figures appeared smaller from this distance, yet the sense of their presence did not diminish. Her gaze caught a fleeting movement in the corner of the taxi window. Was it a reflection, a shadow, or one of the twisted faces from the night before? She could not tell. Panic prickled along her spine, yet she forced herself to look away, focusing on the road ahead. By the time she reached the outskirts, relief mingled with dread. She had left the village, but something had followed her. The whispers, the eyes, the feeling of being observed lingered in every reflection. A window in the city, a darkened mirror in her hotel room, the polished surface of a cafe table. Each one showed her the grotesque ogoh-ogoh face, closer than the last, grinning with a twisted delight that refused to fade. As she collapsed onto her bed, exhaustion overwhelming her, May realized the truth she had not dared admit. The curse had traveled with her. The ritual she had ignored, the playful touch of the sacred effigy, had bound her to a world she could not escape. No city, no street, no mirror would offer sanctuary. And somewhere, just beyond her perception, a whisper hissed, "The night is never done, and neither are we." May closed her eyes, heart pounding, knowing she had fled the village. But the spirits had not fled her, and in that moment she understood that some mistakes cannot be undone, only endured, haunting her forever. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.